Today we'll be walking you through an online renewal using your TennCare Connect account. To learn more about renewals, logging into TennCare Connect, and getting started with a renewal, visit TennCare's YouTube account at youtube.com/TennCareTN. We've also created other videos about using TennCare Connect, like applying for coverage, reviewing old letters, accessibility and linking your case, and filling out paper renewal packet. When the member logs into TennCare Connect and it is their month to renew, they will see a notification on the coverage overview page that tells them it is time for their renewal. To renew coverage in TennCare Connect, click Renew My Coverage from the navigation menu. If you're using a browser from your mobile device, like a smartphone or tablet, the menu will be on the top and not over on the left like it is in this example. On the Renew My Coverage page, click Renew My Coverage next to the case number and renewal date. Let's get started on an example of a renewal. Remember, this is just an example. Your renewal might look different from what you see in this video. Review the Before You Begin information and helpful tips. This will tell you what to expect during your renewal and what changes you might need to make. Click Next to begin the renewal. Each summary page will show you what you need to review. The Review Completed column shows a red X when the information has not been reviewed. You must click Review to see the information TennCare has on file. Once the review is complete, the Review Completed column will have a green check mark. Each listing on a summary page must have a green check mark before you can move forward with your renewal. Let's click Review to begin reviewing the information on this renewal. The Household Information page displays information TennCare knows about the head of household and assisting person. Here's a few things to remember when reviewing information. Fields with a red asterisk next to them are required. It's important to fill out as much information as possible. If any required fields are unanswered, you should complete them. The I symbol next to the field provides additional information about it. Hover the mouse over the I to learn more. Fields that are grayed out cannot be changed. For example, if your name has changed, call TennCare Connect at 855-259-0701 to make this change. You must review the information in the Head of Household Demographics section and make sure it is still correct. Review the information in the Head of Household Home Address section and make sure it is still correct. If you need to change your address, you would do it in this section in the spaces provided. Once you've reviewed that information and made any changes, you can continue to the next section. The Head of Household Mailing Address section is for when you have a mailing address that is different from your home address. Review the information in this section and make sure it is still correct. For this example, there isn't any additional information to review. Remember, this video is just an example. You must make sure that your renewal has your own address listed. The Head of Household Contact Information section lists the contact information TennCare has on file. Review the information in this section and make sure it is still correct. Remember, if there are any required fields that have not been answered, you must select a response before you can move forward. For this example, the member is going to add an assisting person. They would select yes from the questions asking if they want to add one and answer the questions that follow. If you already have an assisting person on file, the information would display and you would need to review the information to make sure it is still correct. If the member needs to learn more about the different types of relationships for assisting persons, they can click on this hyperlink for descriptions. Once everything is correct, click Next. Before continuing the renewal, you must validate any address entered on the Address Validation pop-up window. The address you see will depend on what you've told TennCare. Select the appropriate address on the pop-up window for the head of household and the assisting person, and click Submit. After validating the address, the pop-up window goes away. Click Next again to continue the renewal. After reviewing the head of household's information, you'll return to the summary page. A green checkmark indicates that the information on file has been reviewed. Let's review some of the additional features on this summary page. The remove option is grayed out here because the head of household can't be removed. You can add comments to the renewal about the head of household or assisting person by clicking Add Comments to your renewal. Adding comments is an option available for every summary page. Once there are no more red X's on the summary page and all information is correct, you can move forward by clicking Next. The summary of people in your home page shows what needs to be reviewed for the people in your household. You must click Review for every household member listed on the summary page before you can move forward. Click Review and begin reviewing the information. The People in Your Home page displays the demographic information TennCare has on file for the person you are reviewing. Review the information about who to include and then continue to the Personal Information section. Remember, the fields that are grayed out cannot be changed. If a member's name has changed, they must call TennCare Connect at 855-259-0701. In the Alternative Name Information section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. In the Person's Details section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. In the Applying for Coverage section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. If you already have TennCare and you want to keep your TennCare, do not change this drop-down to No. In the Social Security Information section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. If the number on file is incorrect, you must call Social Security at 800-772-1213. The I icon provides more information. In the Citizenship section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. In the Living Arrangements section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. In the Race section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. For this example, the member needs to complete the questions about race and tell TennCare if they are a member of a federally recognized tribe. In the Ethnicity section, review the information on file and make sure it is still correct. Once everything is correct, click Next. That is all the personal information on file for the first person in this member's household. Once the person's information has been reviewed, anything that changed is listed in the What Changed column, and there is a green check mark in the Review Complete column. Now you can continue to review the information for the other members of the household until everyone has a green check mark. Click Review to review the information for the next person in the household. On the People in Your Home page for the next person, review the information and make sure everything is still correct. For this example, Lucy would like to apply for coverage. When the change is made, additional questions populate that need to be answered. Answer the additional questions that populate. Once everything is correct, click Next. The Additional Details page displays additional information TennCare has or needs. The information displayed on this page could include information about school and employment, pregnancies, former foster care, babies, or emergency medical services. What you see will depend on what TennCare knows about you. For this example, TennCare needs to know if Lucy is reporting a pregnancy. If Lucy was not pregnant, we would select no and continue. However, in this example, we will select yes because Lucy is pregnant or has been in the last 12 months. Since we selected yes, additional questions will appear about the pregnancy and any past pregnancies. Remember, try to answer as many questions as possible, but questions with a red asterisk are required. Once all information is correct, click Next. Once Lucy's information has been reviewed, anything that changed is listed in the What Changed column, and there's a green check mark in the Review Complete column. Click Review to review the information for the next person in the household. Let's review the next household member, Adam. Like in previous examples, you would review the people in your home page and make sure everything is still correct. For this example, the member needs to answer some blank questions. In the race section, the member needs to complete the questions about race and tell TennCare if Adam is a member of a federally recognized tribe. Once everything is correct, click Next. Remember, the Additional Details page displays additional information TennCare has or needs for the person you are reviewing. For this example, you would need to review the information about Adam's school enrollment to make sure it is still correct. If it's not correct, make updates using the drop-down selection. Once all information is correct, click Next. Once a review has been completed for everyone in the household, you can move forward with your renewal. Let's review some additional options in the summary page before clicking Next. Similar options will be available on every summary page, and we'll show you some examples later in this video. If you need to add a person to your household, click Add Another Person. If you need to revisit or change information you've already reviewed, you can click Edit to return to the information. If you need to remove someone from the household or remove information that has ended, you can click Remove. Remember, the head of household can't be removed. Click Add Comments to Renewal to add any comments about the people in your home. For this example, the member needs to add a household member, so they will click Add Another Person. The member needs to answer the questions on the page for the new person. They would fill out as many fields as possible. In the Applying for Coverage section, you can select Yes or No. In this example, the new person being added by the member is applying for coverage, so we will need to select Yes and fill out additional questions that appear. Once all information is correct, click Next. The relationship page displays in this example because there is more than one person in the household. Review the relationships and any other required fields on the page and confirm any existing relationships are correct. For this example, the member also added a new member to the household, so they need to tell TennCare about the new relationship. The members will use the drop-down menu to select the appropriate relationships. In this example, the member we are adding to the household is a child, so we will also need to fill out the primary caregiver section. Up to 2 people can be selected as a primary caregiver for each child. In this case, we'll assume that Sadie has one primary caregiver, Lucy. Once all information is correct, click Next. The Other Health Insurance page asks if anyone in this household is enrolled in health insurance other than TennCare, Cover Kids, or Medicare. If you need to add this information, select Yes and answer the additional questions. If you've already told TennCare you have other insurance, you would be brought to a screen to review the information on file, and you could add new insurance on that page. For this example, the member does not have any information to report here. They'll select No and click Next. The Summary of Tax Information page shows what tax filing information needs to be reviewed for the household. Remember, every record on the summary page must be reviewed before moving forward. Let's review Lucy's tax filing information. On the tax filing page, the member must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. If the member didn't have any tax dependents, they would select No in the tax dependents in this household section and click Next. For this example, Lucy does have tax dependents, so the member will select Yes and add Lucy's tax dependents. Once all information is correct, click Next. On the tax deduction page, the member must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. For this example, there aren't any tax deductions on file for Lucy, so the member needs to answer if Lucy has any tax deductions. For this example, the member needs to report a tax deduction. Lucy has a tax deduction for student loan interest, and the monthly amount is $25. If there are additional deductions, the member can click Add Another. For this example, there aren't any more deductions to add. On the tax dependents outside the household page, you must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. If you have tax dependents outside of the household on file, they would appear here for you to review. For Lucy, there are none on file, so this section is empty. For this example, Lucy does not need to add any tax dependents outside of the household, so the member will select No and click Next. On the Joint Filer outside the household page, you must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. For this example, there aren't any joint filers outside of the household on file for Lucy, so the member must answer if Lucy files jointly with a spouse who lives outside of the household. For this example, Lucy does not file jointly with a spouse outside the household, so the member would select No and click Next. On the tax filer outside the household page, you must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. For this example, no one is being claimed as a dependent by someone outside of the home. This information is still correct, so the member can click Next. Once Lucy's tax information has been reviewed, anything that has changed is listed in the What Changed column, and there is a green check mark in the Review Completed column. You would then click Review for everyone listed on the summary page, make necessary changes, and add additional information as needed. Once everyone listed on the Summary of Tax Information page has a green check mark, you can move forward. You can also revisit or change information you have already reviewed by clicking Edit. If you need to remove a tax filer, you can click Remove and answer the questions that display. You can click Add Comments to your renewal to add any additional information about tax filers or tax dependents in the home. Once everything is correct, click Next. The Summary Employment page shows what employment information needs to be reviewed for the household. Remember, every record on the summary page must be reviewed before moving forward. Let's review Ethan's employment information. On the employment page, you must review the information on file, make sure it's still correct, and answer any required questions. Remember, information in gray can't be changed. If you no longer work at the employer on file, you will still review the information to confirm it was correct when you left. For this example, Ethan no longer works for this employer, but all the information is correct as of the last day of this job. Click Next to return to the summary page. If all information is correct, you would click Next on this page and move forward to the next section. For this example, because Ethan no longer works with this employer, the member would click Remove, answer the questions on the Remove Employment pop-up window, and click Submit. To add a new job, you would click Add Another. In this example, we will be adding a job that Lucy has started. The member must answer all the questions about the new job for Lucy and click Next once everything has been added. Once everything on the Summary of Employment page has a green check mark, you can move forward with the renewal. For this example, there's not any information on file for self-employment, so the member must answer if anyone in their household is self-employed. If you have information on file, you would be brought to the Self-Employment Summary page to review the information. For this example, the member is not adding a self-employment record, so they would select No and click Next. The Summary of Other Income page shows what other income information needs to be reviewed for the household. Remember, every record on the summary page must be reviewed before moving forward. Let's review Ethan's other income information. On the Other Income page, you must review any information on file, make sure it's still correct, and answer any required questions. For this example, the member needs to update the Social Security payments. The member would update the amount and the how much is each payment from this Social Security field. You may also need to provide answers to the questions about in-kind support and maintenance before you can move forward. The member would select answers to the required questions. If the member selects yes, they can tell TennCare about the expenses in the table and answer any additional questions. For this example, the member is selecting no to both questions. Once everything is correct, click Next. Once everything on the Summary of Other Income page has a green check mark, you can move forward with your renewal. Once everything is correct, click Next. The Other Healthcare Questions page asks about other types of care people in the household might need. Review the questions on the page and any pre-populated answers to confirm they're still correct. The eye symbol next to the question provides additional information. Hover the mouse over the eye to learn more. If you need to tell TennCare about someone in the household needing one of these types of care, select Yes and select who needs the care. If you select yes to any of these questions, you must answer the questions about expenses and resources. For this example, we'll say Ethan has Medicare costs. The member would select yes to Does anyone in your household have Medicare and want to get or keep help paying their Medicare costs, and use the checkbox to tell TennCare who wants this care. In this example, Adam also has medical bills. The member would select yes to Has anyone in your home gotten medical care, dental care, or medicine in the last 3 months, and use a checkbox to tell TennCare that Adam wants this care. For this example, the member already has existing expenses and resources on file, so these answers are pre-populated. Once everything is correct, click Next. The Summary of Shelter or Utility Expense page shows what shelter or utility expense needs to be reviewed for the household. Remember, every record on the summary page must be reviewed before moving forward. Let's review Ethan's expense information. On the Shelter or Utility Expense page, the member must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. Review who is responsible for the expense and review the information in the Shelter or Utility Expense section. For this example, Ethan needs to update the amount of expense. They would make the change in the How much is usually paid field. Once everything is correct, click Next. The summary of shelter or utility expense shows after each review. Let's review the next expense record. You must review any information on file, make sure it is still correct, and answer any required questions. Let's review the next expense record. For this example, the trash record needs to be removed because it is now included in the rent. To remove the trash record, the member must return to the summary page. Click Remove next to the appropriate record. On the Remove Ethan Haywood's Shelter or Utility Expense pop-up window, the member must tell TennCare when the expense ended and click Submit. Now the member can see that the record was removed in the What Changed column. If the member removed the record by mistake, they can click Undo. If they undo this change, they'll have to re-review the information. Let's review the last shelter or utility expense record. For this example, everything is correct and the answers are all filled in. Once everything is correct, click Next. Now that everything on the page is correct, the member can click Next. For this example, there is not any information on file for dependent care expenses, so the member must answer if anyone in the household has any of these expenses. For this example, Lucy does need to report a dependent care expense. The member would select Yes and answer as many questions as possible. Once everything is correct, click Next. The Summary of Dependent Care Expense page shows the added expense. Now that everything on this page is correct, the member can click Next. For this example, there is not any information on file for mandatory payment expense, so the member must answer if anyone in their household has any of these expenses. For this example, they are not adding any mandatory payment expenses, so the member must click No and click Next. For this example, the member indicated on the Other Healthcare Questions page that they have paid or unpaid medical bills in the past 3 months, so the Medical Bills page displays. For this example, the member will select Yes and answer the questions on the page about their medical bills. Once everything is correct, click Next. If you have more than one bill, you can add another bill by clicking Add Another and go through the same process as before. In this example, they only have one bill, so they'll click Next. In this example, the Summary of Financial Resources page shows because TennCare already has resources on file. If you don't have resources on file, you would be taken to the Financial Resources page instead. The summary page shows what financial resource records need to be reviewed for the household. Remember, every record on the summary page must be reviewed before moving forward. Let's review Ethan's financial resource information. On the financial resource page, you must review any information on file, make sure it's still correct, and answer any questions. For this example, the member needs to change the value of their checking account and add their checking account number so TennCare has as much information as possible. If you are adding a bank or company, you will type the information you have and select Search. It would then produce a list of options and you would select the correct option. If you don't see the correct bank listed, click I can't find my bank and enter the bank information. Once everything is correct, click Next. Once all the check marks are green and everything is correct, the member can click Next and move forward with their renewal. For this example, Ethan has another financial resource that isn't listed, so the member would click Add Another. On the financial resource page, you must answer as many questions as possible when adding a new resource. In this example, Ethan has a savings account that isn't on file. The member must answer as many questions about the saving account as they can. Once everything is correct, click Next. Once all the check marks are green and everything is correct, the member can click Next and move forward with their renewal. If you need to revisit or change information you've already reviewed, click Edit and return to the information. If a resource needs to be removed, click Remove and answer the questions that display. Click Add Comments to your renewal to add any comments about other income in the household. Once everything is correct, click Next. The Summary Vehicle page shows what vehicle records need to be reviewed for the household. Let's review Ethan's vehicle information. On the Vehicle page, the member must review any information on file, make sure it's still correct, and answer any required questions. For this example, the vehicle needs to be removed from Ethan's records because he has purchased a new vehicle. To remove this vehicle, the member must return to the Summary page. Click Next to return to the Summary page. Click Remove next to the vehicle you just reviewed and enter the date it was last owned to remove the vehicle. For this example, we need to add a different vehicle, so the member would click Add Another. On the Vehicle page, the member must answer as many questions as possible about their vehicle. Once everything is correct, click Next. The member is done adding another vehicle and has reviewed the page, so they would click Next. For this example, there is not any information on file for property resources, so the member must answer if anyone in their household has any. If the member needs to add this information, they would select Yes and answer the questions. For this example, the member is not adding any property records, so they must select No and click Next. For this example, there is not any information on file for burial resources, so the member must answer if anyone in their household has any burial agreements. If the member needs to add this information, they would select Yes and answer the questions. For this example, the member is not adding any burial resource records, so they would select No and click Next. For this example, there is not any information on file for life insurance, so the member must answer if anyone in their household has life insurance. If no one in the household had life insurance, they would select No and click Next. For this example, they need to add a life insurance record. They would select Yes and answer as many questions as possible. Once everything is correct, click Next. If nothing else needs to be added, click Next. For this example, there is not any information on file for any other resources. The member must answer if anyone in their household has resources that TennCare hasn't asked about. If the member needs to add this information, they would select Yes and answer the questions. For this example, the member is not adding any additional resource records. They must select No and click Next. For this example, there's not any information on file for any resources that the member has sold, traded, or given away in the last 5 years. The member must answer if anyone in their household has done this. For this example, the member needs to tell TennCare about the car Ethan sold. They would select Yes and answer all the questions they can. Once everything is correct, click Next. Review the summary page, and if nothing else needs to be added, click Next. It's almost time to submit the renewal to TennCare, but first you must review all the information you've put in your renewal to confirm everything looks correct. You can use the drop-down arrows on this page to expand each section of the renewal summary. If anything needs to be added or corrected, click the section in the progress bar to return to the associated summary page and update the answers. Click the Finish circle in the progress bar to return to the Renewal Summary page once you have made the changes. Once you have confirmed everything is correct, you can click Next to move forward with the renewal. The Review Your Comments page shows any comments you added throughout the renewal. If there is anything additional that you need to add, you can use the text box on this page. Once you have confirmed everything is correct, you can click Next to move forward with your renewal. You need to review all the information on the Before You Submit page. It's very important. You must review the information in the voter registration section and select if you want to apply to register to vote where you live now. Then you must review the information about renewing your coverage and select if you want to give TennCare permission to renew your coverage automatically using tax information. If you do, you must tell TennCare how many years you want eligibility automatically renewed for. Once you've completed this page, click Next and move forward with your renewal. It's time to sign the renewal and submit it to TennCare. You must carefully review all the information in the sections on this page. This page tells you about rights, responsibilities, and penalties, your right to privacy, and non-discrimination. Then you should review the information about the electronic signature and sign your name in the signature field at the bottom of the page. Then click Submit to submit your renewal to TennCare. Congratulations, you've completed your renewal. You can review the information about your confirmation and write down your tracking number to keep track of your renewal.